What's up everybody, it's Matt from Peter Glenn, and in this video we're going to show you how to prep your board for summer storage. Let's check this out. So it's the saddest time of the year. It's time you realize that there's no more riding to be had this season and we need to put our board away for the summer. And you can obviously just take it and throw it in the garage, throw it in the closet, put it wherever you store it. But there are a few things that you should do that can actually help prolong the life of your board, but also make sure that it's a little bit more ready for that day one of next season. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that your board is completely dry. And I always say start by taking the bindings off, and basically getting those things off is going to make sure that everything underneath the bindings is nice and dry. Obviously things can get a little bit funky when they're wet, but again, just storing it in a nice dry place and making sure that your board is dry is definitely a good thing to do. So we're going to take these bindings off. We're going to go ahead and set those aside and get out some paper towels, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to wipe this thing down underneath where the bindings were, up on the tips. And then obviously if you just got done riding and you have a wet base, wipe down the edges too and make sure that there is no moisture anywhere on the edges themselves. And I also should have mentioned too, when you set your bindings down, especially again if you just got done riding, just set them so the bottoms can dry. Set them so the bottoms are kind of up, and just let those things dry out. Because if you are going to put them back on your board, you don't want them wet. Another thing that you can do too, not something you absolutely have to do, but get a little bit of Windex out, some sort of nice light cleaner, and just clean off the top of your board. Now going back to the base, if it's not a day where you just got done riding, and maybe it's been a couple weeks, and you're kind of looking at your edges and maybe you see a little bit of rust on the edges, we definitely want to clean that up as well. And the way we do that is I like to use a little gummy stone, and you basically just want to rub that along the edges and you can kind of clean up those spots where there maybe is a little bit of rust. If you're storing the board on its tips, a lot of times you're going to get some of that rust on the tips. But using that gummy stone, again, just giving it a quick rub right on the edge will clean that up and make sure that there's no rust accumulating on your board through the summer months. And if you don't have that gummy stone, you can use steel wool, basically anything that can get that rust off of the metal. So now that we've got the board nice and dry, nice and clean, and now we're ready to wax this thing. And this can be a good time too if you're going to put your bindings back on the board to store them, and if they're dried out, to actually grab your bindings and we're going to put them back on the board. But again, if they're not dry, you don't have to put them on the board to wax it. All right, so on to waxing your board. Now we actually have another video that's all about how to hot wax your board, but for this one we're only going to do half of that, but we'll leave a link in the description if you want to check that video out. But for this, to get your board ready for the summer, all we're going to need an iron, we're going to need wax, and we're going to need some base cleaner and obviously some paper towel. And we're going to go ahead and clean the base. So cleaning the base is super easy. You basically just take a little bit of that base cleaner, take our paper towel, get a little dab on there, and go ahead and wipe that base down and make sure that we get all of the dirt and the gunk and all of that stuff off the bottom of the board. Depending on how scratched up your board is, some of these little scrapes and cuts, sometimes you'll actually see dirt down inside of those. And we want to get that clean, and it can be a little bit hard to get with just the paper towel. So if you do have a brush of some sort, usually with more of a stiffer bristle, we don't want something too crazy coarse, but a lot of times taking that and just giving it a light scrape, that can get that gunk out of those scratches without having to go too crazy and without having to sit there and try to scrub with a paper towel to find out that nothing's coming out of there, especially if it's late season and you are getting that sticky film from all of the dirty snow melting over the entire season. And then we're going to take the board and let it sit and make sure that all of that evaporates. There's a little bit more of that base cleaner still sitting inside the base, and we want that all evaporated out of the base before we wax. All right, so now that our base is completely dry, it's time to do the hot wax. So obviously we want to make sure our iron is plugged in, and we want to turn that temperature up, and we're just going to let that sit and warm up for a minute. We want to find that proper temperature for melting the wax. Now, one thing you'll notice is because I had some wax on there before, you notice the smoke coming off of this. This means that it's too hot. So what we want to do is we want to turn that down. We want to find that spot where it's not smoking. That means it's not burning the wax. We just want to melt the wax and get a nice clean drip onto our board. Somewhere just over 100 degrees on most of these irons is going to get you right where you need to drip the wax. And dripping the wax is super easy. I like to turn the iron upside down and use kind of one of the corners, and we're gonna just push the wax against the iron and just let it melt. Just be careful, obviously, not to touch it with your fingers because this thing is very, very hot. Now, as we do this, we're gonna start dripping the wax along the board. Me, I like to go one along the edges of the board because that's obviously where most of the pressure is, and that's where the board usually dries out the fastest. So literally just kind of do drips all along the edge of the board. Now, one thing that you'll notice too is as I'm doing this, I'm not getting a lot of drip off of this. So that means that I can turn it up just a tiny, tiny bit to make sure that the wax is melting a little bit faster. But again, we want to make sure that it's not smoking as it's coming off of the iron. So again, just kind of lightly drip all along the edges, and you don't have to do a straight line. Depending on how much ironing you want to do at the end to smooth the wax out, depends on how much wax you're actually going to want on the board. So once you've got those sides done, I like to go up and down in kind of a zigzag pattern from nose to tail. And then once I get to the tail, then I'll go the opposite way and kind of cross over the path that I just did. And this is basically giving you a good kind of base to work with when we're gonna melt this into the board. So obviously now that we've got all those drips all over the bottom of our board, we need to smooth this thing out, and we need to make sure that it is a nice uniform and we have this wax spread all over the bottom of the board in as much of an even surface as we can. It doesn't have to be perfectly even, but we want to make sure that every part of the dry base actually has some wax on it. So we're gonna go ahead and just set the iron on the board and start going in a circular motion. I like to go towards the edges again first, but we want to melt that wax and smooth it out so every part of the dry base of the board is covered in wax. So one thing that is good to note is that you do want to keep the iron moving. Do not leave it in one spot. A concentrated amount of heat in the middle of your board can damage your board. Not only burn your base, but it can actually delaminate the board. All right, so once you're getting down to the end where you're getting all of those drips melted in, you're not seeing any more of those dots from those drips, one thing you want to do is kind of scan the base, keep the iron moving, but look for those dry spots. One thing that you can do is wherever you have lights, just kind of use that light, and then you can actually see, again, those dry spots and those low areas where there is no wax. And again, just make sure that you have everything all filled in. Make sure all of those dry parts of the base have some melted wax on them. And your board is basically ready to go. So once we actually have that wax on the board, usually with the standard wax job, we're gonna scrape this board, but instead for summer prep, we're just gonna go ahead and leave it on the board. This is basically gonna protect the base, and it's gonna allow that wax to really sit in the base and just keep the base nice and keep it from drying out over the summer. So when you go to store this thing, whether you have the bindings on or off, we want to store it in a nice, dry, cool place. If you do store it without the bindings on it, it can't hurt to put it in that sleeve that it came in, if it did come in a sleeve, not just in some shrink wrap, or if you kept the box, if you had it shipped to you. But just basically keep it again in that dry, cool place. And then if you do have the wax on the bottom of the board and you are gonna store it upright, don't set it against a wall, because again, if it does get that wax on the wall, it might not be something that you're gonna be too stoked on. But the cool thing about this is that this board is nice and protected, and this base is ready to go, and all you have to do before day one of next season is scrape it, buff it, and you're ready to ride. All right, so hopefully that helped out a little bit. And if you got any questions beyond what we talked about in the video, definitely leave some comments down below. We're on there every single day trying to answer your questions. We want to make sure we can get you into some rad gear, but most importantly, we want to make sure you can maintain it and it's going to last you as long as possible too. Also, make sure to like, subscribe, and definitely get that notification bell on too so you can find out when all the new videos drop. And a sad time at the end of the year to get that board all put away. But again, it's gonna be ready for that day one of next year so you can get out and ride, because any day riding is a good day riding.